fluorescent lights hummed their dying yellow song overhead. It was the kind of sound that drilled into the base of your skull if you stood under it long enough, a miserable mechanical whine that matched the general misery of a Tuesday night in November. Sloane shifted her weight from one worn boot to the other, staring blankly at the tabloid magazines lining the checkout aisle. Her jacket was damp, the cheap synthetic fabric had never been designed for real weather, and the Seattle rain had found every single one of its manufacturing defects. She'd been on her feet for 11 hours at the diner, her back ached, and all she wanted was to get home to her tiny studio apartment, microwave her frozen dinner, and pretend the world didn't exist for a few hours. The line ahead of her was stalled. A woman in front let out an exaggerated sigh, checking her wristwatch with theatrical aggression. People in this part of the city were always in a hurry to get back to nowhere. Sloane leaned slightly to see the holdup. At the register stood an older woman. She was small, slightly stooped, and aggressively fumbling through a worn leather wallet that had seen better decades. "Ma'am, it's $23.40, the cashier said, popping a bubble of pink gum. Her eyes were dead, fixed on some point beyond the old woman's shoulder. "You gave me a 20. Yes, I know." The older woman's voice trembled, not with fear, but with the frustrating, uncontrollable shake of age. Her fingers, spotted and thin, scraped against the bottom of the empty coin pocket. "I had a 5. I know I had a 5. My granddaughter gave it to me this morning." "Well, you don't have it now. Do you want me to put the milk back or the oranges?" The cruelty wasn't intentional. It was just the abrasive sandpaper reality of minimum wage retail at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. But the words hit the old woman hard. Her shoulders slumped. She looked down at the small cluster of items on the black conveyor belt, a carton of whole milk, a bag of bruised oranges, a loaf of cheap white bread. "No. I need the milk," she mumbled, her hands dropping to her sides. She looked entirely lost, adrift in a fluorescent-lit sea of consumer goods and indifferent strangers. Sloane watched her face. There was a profound, suffocating embarrassment in her pale blue eyes. It was a look Sloane knew intimately. It was the look her mother used to get when the card declined at the pharmacy, the crushing weight of public inadequacy that made you want to dissolve into the floor. Sloane didn't have money to burn. Her checking account currently boasted a laughable 2-digit balance, and her rent was due in 4 days. But she couldn't stand the smell of sour patience radiating from the line anymore, and she couldn't watch this woman shrink under the cashier's flat, judgmental stare. She stepped out of her place in line, walked past the annoyed woman, and slapped a crumpled $5 bill onto the sticky black plastic of the conveyor belt. "Keep the change," Sloane said to the cashier. The cashier didn't look surprised, just bored. She snatched the 5, hit a button on the register, and the drawer shot open with a mechanical ding. The old woman turned to Sloane. Up close, her frailty was even more apparent, the papery skin, the thin white hair, the way her hands trembled against her shopping bag. Yet there was something wildly incongruous about her. Her wool coat was frayed at the cuffs, but the material was incredibly soft, cashmere, maybe, and beneath the fraying sleeve, a heavy silver watch caught the harsh overhead light. It didn't look like a cheap knockoff. It looked heavy. Real. "You didn't have to do that, sweetheart," the old woman said, her voice thickening with emotion. "It's $3, Sloane replied, keeping her tone light, brushing off the gratitude before it could get heavy. "I spend more than that on terrible coffee. Don't worry about it. People aren't usually this kind." The old woman picked up her plastic bags, her hands still shaking. "My granddaughter, she tells me the world is a wicked place. She worries too much, that girl. Worries. The world is what it is." Sloane offered a tired smile. Have a good night, ma'am. Get home safe. Eleanor, the old woman said, nodding slowly. My name is Eleanor. Sloane. Eleanor smiled. It transformed her face, stripping away the confusion and leaving something remarkably sharp behind. Thank you, Sloane. Elara will be very pleased you helped me. She turned and shuffled out the automatic glass doors, disappearing into the wet black night. Sloane didn't think twice about the name Elara. She just stepped back into line, paid for her frozen dinner and cheap coffee grounds, and braced herself for the cold walk back to her apartment. The walk took 20 minutes. The rain had turned to a fine freezing mist that found every gap in her jacket's inadequate zipper. She let herself into her building, the lock sticking the way it always did, requiring a hard shoulder shove to turn the deadbolt. Her apartment smelled like dust and old radiator heat, the familiar scent of poverty and neglect. She kicked off her wet boots, tossed her keys onto the chipped laminate counter, and microwaved her dinner. It was a completely ordinary night. Quiet, depressing, utterly normal Tuesday. She ate her frozen lasagna in silence, watching the rain streak the dirty glass of her single window. The noodles were rubbery, the cheese congealed, but it was hot and it was food and she was too tired to care. She didn't know that 3 miles away, in a sprawling gated estate on the affluent north side of the city, a woman was watching security footage of her face. She didn't know that the $5 bill she'd casually tossed on a counter had just rewritten the trajectory of her entire life. Tuesday nights at the Rusty Anchor were an exercise in slow, agonizing boredom. The dive bar sat on a corner that the city's gentrification had somehow miraculously missed, a last bastion of sticky floors and cheap whiskey in a neighborhood slowly being consumed by artisanal coffee shops and boutique gyms. It smelled perpetually of stale beer, bleach, and the ghosts of cigarettes smoked decades ago. Sloane wiped down the sticky mahogany bar with a damp rag, her mind entirely blank. She'd been working here for 2 years, pouring cheap whiskey for men who'd given up on better things, collecting tips from people who had less than she did but were generous anyway. The clock on the wall above the registers ticked toward 11 p.m. Only 3 patrons sat in the booths, all regulars, all nursing half-empty glasses in comfortable silence. Then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a loud noise that changed the room. It was the absolute sudden absence of it. The faint hum of conversation died. The front door swung open, letting in a gust of freezing wind, and 3 women stepped inside. They didn't belong here. They wore dark, tailored overcoats that probably cost more than the bar's liquor license. They moved with a terrifying synchronized grace, fanning out slightly as they assessed the room. 2 of them were built like freight trains, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, their eyes cold and scanning. The third woman walked between them. She was taller, leaner, and possessed a quiet, dense gravity that pulled the air right out of the room. She didn't look like a thug. She looked like an executive. Except for the brutal flat emptiness in her dark eyes. Her hair was jet black, cut short and sharp against the sharp angles of her face. She unbuttoned her overcoat slowly, revealing a charcoal suit underneath. The faint scent of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic, primal, alpha, drifted across the bar. Sloane stopped wiping. The rag grew cold in her hand. Her instincts, honed by years of living in bad neighborhoods and working in worse ones, screamed at her to find a back door. This wasn't a robbery. Robbers were jumpy, loud, desperate. These women were comfortable. They owned the space the second they crossed the threshold. The woman in the center walked directly toward the bar. She pulled out a stool, the hinges squealing in protest under the sudden weight, and sat down opposite Sloane. "Can I help you?" Sloane asked. She hated how steady her voice sounded. It felt like a lie. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, the pulse of an omega caught in the presence of a dominant alpha. She'd never met an alpha who smelled like that, like cedar and cold rain and something darker beneath, something that made the back of her neck prickle with awareness. The woman looked at her. Really looked at her. Studied her face, taking in the cheap uniform shirt, the tired bags under her eyes, the rigid way she held her shoulders. Her nostrils flared slightly, an almost imperceptible movement, and something flickered in her dark gaze. Recognition. "Sloane," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was a low, rough baritone, the kind that resonated in your chest. "Do I know you?" "No." The alpha leaned forward, resting her hands on the bar. She wore no rings, but there was a faint jagged scar crossing the back of her left hand. "My name is Alara Rossi." The name hit the room like a physical blow. One of the regulars in the back booth suddenly stood up, dropped a 20 on the table, and practically sprinted for the door, keeping his head down. Alara's guards didn't even flinch. Sloane recognized the name. You didn't live in the city without knowing the Rossi family. They owned the shipping yards, the unions, a significant portion of the politicians. They were old money built on old blood, and everyone knew the Rossi matriarchs had been alphas for generations, their omega partners kept safe and hidden behind walls of steel and silence. "What can I get you, Ms. Rossi?" Sloane asked, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "We only have 2 beers on tap, and I doubt you drink rail whiskey." Alara didn't smile. "I'm not here for a drink." She reached into the inner pocket of her suit jacket. Sloane tensed, half expecting a weapon. Instead, Alara pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope and slid it across the sticky mahogany until it rested inches from Sloane's hand. "My grandmother," Alara said quietly, "has vascular dementia. It comes and goes. Some days she's perfectly sharp. Other days she thinks it's 1985 and she needs to walk down to the corner store to buy milk for my mother." "The grocery store." "The old woman in the frayed coat." "Eleanor." Sloane stared at the envelope. "She slipped her security detail yesterday evening." Alara's voice tightened slightly, the first crack in her stone facade. "She walked 12 blocks in the rain. We were tearing the neighborhood apart looking for her. By the time we tracked her watch's GPS, she was already walking back." Alara leaned forward. The scent of cold air, expensive cedar cologne, and something faintly metallic washed over Sloane. Her omega instincts stirred, caught between fear and fascination. This was a dangerous woman. Every cell in Sloane's body knew it. "My people pulled the security footage from the grocery store," Alara continued. "I saw what happened. I saw the cashier humiliate her. And I saw you. I just paid for her milk." Sloane's voice was dry. "It was $3. It's not a big deal." "It is a big deal." Alara's voice sharpened. "In my world, nobody does something for nothing. People exploit weakness. They don't cover a stranger's grocery bill out of the goodness of their hearts. Especially not people who look like they needed the $5 more than she did." Sloane felt a flash of hot defensive anger burn through her fear. "Excuse me? You're working in a failing bar. Your shoes are falling apart. You walk home to a subsidized apartment." Alara listed off with clinical precision. "You need money." She tapped the envelope. "There's $20,000 in there. Cash. It's a thank you. Take it." Sloane looked at the thick white envelope. $20,000. It would clear her debts. It would fix her life. It was sitting right there, a solution to every problem she'd been drowning in for years. She looked up from the envelope to Alara Rossi's flat, expecting eyes. The alpha thought she had her figured out. Thought everyone had a price, and she'd just met hers. Sloane reached out. She didn't pick up the envelope. Instead, she placed 2 fingers on top of it and slid it firmly back across the bar until it hit Alara's hand. "I don't want your money," Sloane said quietly. Her voice held no tremble now. Alara frowned. The slight narrowing of her eyes was the most dangerous thing Sloane had seen all night. "Excuse me?" It was $3. Sloane picked up her damp rag again. "I did it because I wanted to go home," and she was holding up the line. "I don't need a reward. And I definitely don't want to owe a favor to a woman like you." She met Alara's gaze steadily. "So take your envelope, Ms. Rossi, and have a good night." Alara stared at her. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. The 2 guards by the door shifted, their hands dropping subtly toward their waistbands. Alara raised a hand, a sharp, minimal gesture that froze her women instantly. She looked down at the rejected envelope, then back up at Sloane. Slowly, an unfamiliar expression crossed her face. It wasn't anger. It was curiosity. "You don't want to owe me," Alara repeated softly, testing the words on her tongue. "No." Alara picked up the envelope and slipped it back into her jacket. She didn't break eye contact. "All right, Sloane. I won't force you to take it. But I don't like unpaid debts. And I certainly don't like leaving loose ends." She stood. The stool didn't squeal this time. She turned and walked toward the door. Her guards opened it before she reached it. The freezing wind whipped through the bar once more, and then they were gone, swallowed by the night. Sloane stood frozen behind the bar, her hands shaking so hard she had to grip the wood to steady herself. She had just rejected $20,000 from a mafia boss. An alpha mafia boss. An alpha mafia boss whose scent had made her knees weak despite every survival instinct screaming at her to run. She thought she was being smart. Thought she was cutting the tie. She was wrong. She had just tied the knot. Paranoia is a quiet disease. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It makes you check the deadbolt 3 times instead of 2. It makes you memorize the license plates of the cars parked on your street. For 3 days after the encounter at the Rusty Anchor, Sloane lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. You didn't tell a woman like Alara Rossi to take a hike without consequences. You just didn't. Thursday morning arrived with the pale, sickly light of a city struggling against winter. Sloane sat in the corner of a 24-hour laundromat, watching her faded work shirts tumble in the dryer. The place smelled of industrial bleach and cheap floral fabric softener. A fluorescent bulb flickered rhythmically above row 4, casting a twitchy nervous strobe across the peeling linoleum floor. She was exhausted. Sleep had become a fragmented, elusive thing, broken by the memory of Alara's flat dark eyes and the way her scent had curled around Sloane like a warning and a promise wrapped in one. The bell above the glass door chimed. Sloane didn't look up from her beat-up paperback. People drifted in and out of this place like ghosts. It wasn't until the heavy scent of cedar and cold rain overpowered the smell of bleach that her stomach dropped. Alara stood at the end of the aisle. She looked entirely absurd in this environment, like a panther in a petting zoo. She wore a dark navy wool coat over a charcoal turtleneck that hugged the broad lines of her shoulders. No guards this time. She was alone, and somehow that made her infinitely more intimidating. Sloane closed her book, marking the page with her thumb. "Are you stalking me, Ms. Rossi? Because I'm pretty sure there are laws about that. Even for people who own the judges." Elara didn't smile. She walked slowly down the aisle, her gaze sweeping over the rusted coin machines, the overflowing trash bins, and finally settling on Sloane. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that Sloane could smell her again, that devastating blend of expensive scent and something darker beneath. "My grandmother refused to eat her breakfast this morning," Elara said. Her voice was a low rumble that blended with the rhythmic thumping of the dryers. Sloane blinked, completely derailed by the statement. She'd braced herself for a threat or a bribe or an eviction notice. Not a dietary report. "I'm sorry?" She has it in her head that the girl from the grocery store is in trouble. Elara's jaw tightened. Dementia is a cruel architect. It builds realities out of fragments. She remembers you paying for her groceries. She remembers my people bringing me the security footage. Now she thinks you're starving because you gave her your last $5. She won't touch her food until she knows you're provided for. Sloane let out a harsh, involuntary laugh. It sounded scraped raw. "So you tracked me down to a laundromat in the worst ward of the city to tell me your grandmother is worried about my financial stability?" "I tracked you down," Elara said, leaning slightly against the vibrating metal of a washing machine, "because I have a problem I need to solve. And you are the crux of it. I told you I don't want your money." "I know what you told me." Elara's dark eyes locked onto Sloane's, stripping away the defensive layers she tried to project. "I spent the last 3 days running a background check on you, Sloane." Sloane's grip tightened on her book. "That's a massive invasion of privacy. It's standard operating procedure." Elara counted smoothly. "You have $34 in your checking account. You're 2 months behind on your heating bill. Your mother died of ovarian cancer 3 years ago, leaving you drowning in medical debt that you are slowly, painfully trying to chip away at by pouring cheap liquor for alcoholics." The words felt like physical blows. She was laying out the pathetic, fragile anatomy of Sloane's life for them both to examine under the harsh laundromat lights. A flush of hot humiliation crept up Sloane's neck. "Stop," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I am simply stating facts. You are drowning." Elara reached into her coat pocket. She didn't pull out an envelope this time, she pulled out a small, heavy piece of cardstock. "I don't like owing debts. In my family, an unpaid debt is a vulnerability. It implies a lack of control. You did something for my blood. Now I have to balance the ledger." She stepped forward and placed the card on top of Sloane's paperback. It was a business card, matte black, thick, with a single phone number printed in embossed silver ink. "I won't hand you cash. I see it insults your pride." Elara's tone shifted, threading with something dangerously close to respect. "But I own 3 legitimate restaurants downtown. The kind where a bottle of wine costs more than your monthly rent. I need a front-of-house manager for the one on 5th. The pay is triple what you make at the bar. Full health benefits." Sloane stared at the black card. It felt heavy, like a lead weight pressing into her hand. This wasn't charity. This was a calculated strategic move. It was employment, but it was employment under her shadow. "Why?" Sloane asked, looking up. "Why go through all this trouble for a stranger?" "Because Eleanor asked me to." Elara replied instantly. But there was a hesitation in her eyes, a brief flicker of something unsettled. "And because I have never met someone who looks at a lifeline and spits in the face of the woman throwing it." She held Sloane's gaze. "Call the number or don't. But if you don't, Eleanor starves. And I will have to find a much less polite way to balance my ledger." Elara didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked out, the bell chiming a cheerful goodbye as she vanished back into the gray city, leaving Sloane alone with the rhythmic thud of the dryer and a choice she never asked for. Fear has a specific metallic taste. It floods the back of your throat right before the adrenaline hits. Sloane knew the taste intimately. She tasted it now, choking on the damp, freezing air of the alleyway behind the rusty anchor. It had been 4 days since the laundromat. The black business card burned a hole in her coat pocket. She hadn't called the number. She'd stubbornly clung to her miserable independence, pouring drinks and ignoring the creeping dread that she was making a catastrophic mistake. Tonight, the mistake caught up with her. She was dragging a heavy plastic garbage bag toward the rusted dumpster when the shadows near the brick wall detached themselves. 2 women. They didn't have the tailored lethal elegance of Ilara's security detail. They were rough, erratic, and smelled of stale sweat and cheap alcohol. "Look at this," the taller one rasped, stepping into the dim yellow pool of the security light. She held a switchblade, the blade caught the light, a wicked slender sliver of silver. Rossi's little charity project. Sloane dropped the trash bag. It hit the wet pavement with a heavy thud. She took a slow step backward, her eyes darting toward the back door of the bar. Closed. Solid steel. No handle on the outside. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sloane said. "Keep the voice steady. Keep the eyes moving. Find a weapon. A broken bottle. A loose brick. Anything. Don't play dumb, sweetheart." The shorter woman giggled, a terrible wet sound. "Word on the street is the Ice Queen herself sent her personal guard to check on a dive bar waitress. Rossi doesn't do favors. She doesn't have friends. Which means you're either a liability, or you're a weakness. We figure we can use a weakness." They were moving in, cutting off her escape route to the street. Sloane's breath hitched in her chest. Rejecting Ilara's money hadn't severed her ties to her. It had painted a massive, glowing target on her back. In the underworld ecosystem, any anomaly was exploited. She was the anomaly. The tall woman lunged, grabbing the collar of Sloane's cheap winter coat. Sloane screamed, throwing her weight backward and driving her knee up sharply. She caught the woman in the thigh. She grunted, her grip slipping, but she retaliated with a vicious backhand that caught Sloane across the cheekbone. The force of the blow sent Sloane crashing into the metal side of the dumpster. Pain exploded behind her eyes, brilliant and blinding. She tasted blood. The woman raised the switchblade, stepping over her. "Stupid bitch. Now we do this the hard way." She never finished the sentence. From the mouth of the alley, a shape moved with terrifying velocity. There was no shout, no warning, just the sickening wet crunch of bones snapping under immense pressure. Sloane blinked through the stars exploding in her vision. The tall woman was on the ground, not moving, her arm bent at an impossible grotesque angle. Standing over her was Ilara Rossi. She didn't look like the tailored executive from the laundromat. She looked like violence incarnate. Her overcoat was open, her posture coiled and brutal. The scent of her rage filled the alley, dark, possessive, alpha fury that made Sloane's omega instincts whimper in submission even as her conscious mind screamed at her to run. The shorter woman froze, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror as she recognized the woman who had just shattered her partner. "Ms. Rossi," the woman stammered, raising her hands, dropping her own knife. "We didn't know. We thought she was just..." Ilara didn't speak. She stepped over the unconscious body on the ground, grabbed the second woman by the throat, and slammed her backward into the brick wall. The impact knocked the breath from the woman's lungs in a sharp hiss. Sloane pushed herself up against the dumpster, clutching her throbbing cheek. She watched, paralyzed, as Ilara squeezed. The muscles in her back corded tight beneath her suit. The woman's legs kicked frantically, her hands tearing uselessly at Ilara's iron grip. Ilara's face was an absolute void. No anger, no pleasure. Just the clinical application of lethal force. Ilara, stop. Sloane's voice was a ragged whisper. She wasn't even sure the Alpha heard her over the rain and the desperate gasps of the dying woman. But she did. Ilara froze. Slowly, methodically, she opened her hand. The woman collapsed to the wet pavement, gasping violently, clutching her bruised throat. If you ever look at her again, Ilara said, her voice entirely devoid of inflection, I will peel the skin from your face while you watch. Run. The woman scrambled backward on her hands and knees, scrambling over her unconscious partner before bolting into the dark street like a hunted animal. Silence descended on the alley. Heavy and suffocating. Ilara turned to face Sloane. Her chest was heaving slightly. She reached into her coat and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief. She stepped toward her. Sloane flinched, pressing herself harder against the cold metal of the dumpster. Ilara stopped. A muscle feathered in her jaw. She looked at Sloane cowering from her, looked at the blood swelling on her cheek, and then looked down at her own hands. For a fractured second, the Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a woman looking at a disaster she couldn't buy her way out of. You didn't call the number, Ilara said quietly. Would it have stopped them? Sloane shot back, her voice shaking with adrenaline and pain. They didn't want me, Ilara. They wanted you. I'm just the bait. I know. Ilara closed the distance between them slowly, telegraphing her movements. She gently pressed the handkerchief against the cut on Sloane's cheekbone. Her touch was jarringly soft, a tenderness that seemed impossible coming from hands that had just shattered bone. That is why you're coming with me. I'm not going anywhere with you. Your stubbornness is going to get you killed, Sloane. Ilara's dark eyes locked onto hers. You stepped into my world the second you paid for that milk. I tried to pay you off. You refused. I tried to employ you. You refused. You left me no clean options. She grabbed Sloane's hand, ignoring her resistance, and pulled her gently but firmly away from the dumpster. So now we do it my way. You belong to the Rossi family now. For your own protection. The heavy armored doors of Ilara's SUV sealed shut with a soft vacuum-like click, instantly cutting off the sounds of the freezing rain and the distant sirens of the city. Inside the vehicle, the silence was absolute. Sloane sat rigid against the black leather seat, holding the bloody handkerchief to her face. Her cheekbone throbbed in time with her rapid heartbeat. She stared out the tinted window, watching the neon signs of her neighborhood blur into the sleet. Ilara sat across from her, posture straight, eyes fixed on a tablet in her lap. She had just shattered a woman's arm and nearly crushed another's windpipe, yet her breathing was entirely even. She looked like a woman reviewing a quarterly earnings report. Sloane's omega instincts were in chaos. Every cell in her body recognized Ilara as a dominant alpha, dangerous, powerful, and utterly in control. But beneath the fear, beneath the adrenaline, something else stirred. Something that had no business existing in the presence of a woman who had just demonstrated such casual brutality. Protection. The alpha had protected her. Had come for her. Had nearly killed for her. I have a shift at the bar tomorrow, Sloane said, her voice thin. Ilara didn't look up from her screen. I bought the bar 20 minutes ago. You no longer work there. The sheer casual absurdity of the statement punched the air right out of Sloane's lungs. You bought a bar at midnight because I have a shift? The current owner had gambling debts. The transfer was highly motivated. Elara swiped a finger across the glass. I told you, Sloane. You are a vulnerability. As long as you are walking the streets unprotected, my enemies will use you to get to me. I cannot allow that. So I'm a prisoner. You are a guest. Elara finally looked up. You will have a room, fresh food, and security. When the people who ordered that hit in the alley are identified and removed, you can go back to your life. Until then, you stay. They passed through the heavy iron gates of the Rossi estate 20 minutes later. The property sat on a sprawling cliffside overlooking the dark churning water of the bay. It was less a house and more a fortress, built of gray stone and reinforced glass. Cameras tracked the vehicle's progress up the winding driveway. Inside, the estate was cavernous and cold. The floors were polished marble that echoed sharply under Sloane's cheap wet boots. Everything smelled of lemon polish and sterile air conditioning. No photographs, no clutter, no signs that human beings actually lived here. It looked like a museum exhibit of immense wealth. A woman in a white medical coat was waiting in the foyer. Elara gestured toward Sloane. Fix her face. No narcotics unless she asks for them. The doctor guided her to a brightly lit side room, sitting her down on a leather exam chair. She cleaned the cut on Sloane's cheek with cold efficiency, applied butterfly closures, and handed her an ice pack. She didn't ask Sloane's name. She didn't ask what happened. In this house, people clearly knew better than to ask questions. When Sloane emerged, Elara was standing at the base of a sweeping dual staircase. She had shed the overcoat, leaving her in the dark turtleneck and suit trousers. Without a word, she led Sloane up the stairs and down a long, dimly lit corridor. The guest room was larger than Sloane's entire apartment. A massive king-sized bed dominated the space, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-lashed bay. A fire was already crackling in a stone hearth. Your clothes are wet, Elara noted, her eyes dropping briefly to Sloane's shivering frame. There is a wardrobe in the dressing room. The tags are still on. Wear what you want tomorrow. Someone will collect your personal effects from your apartment. I don't want your clothes. I want my own things. Your apartment was compromised the moment those women cornered you. Elara's tone hardened. They know where you live. They know your routines. Going back there is suicide. Accept the reality of your situation, Sloane. It will make this much easier. And what about Eleanor? Sloane shot back. Does she know you drag women off the street to balance your ledgers? A shadow passed over Elara's face, the first genuine crack in her composure since the alley. My grandmother is asleep. She had a difficult day. You will not disturb her. Right. Because the great Elara Rossi can control everything except a dying woman's memory. It was a cruel thing to say. Sloane knew it the moment the words left her mouth. She was angry, terrified, and lashing out at the only target available. But beneath the anger was something else, a desperate need to provoke a reaction, to see something human beneath the ice. Elara stepped fully into the room. The air pressure seemed to change, dropping 10 degrees. She walked slowly towards Sloane, stopping only when the toes of her expensive shoes nearly touched Sloane's damp boots. I control what I must to keep my family alive, Elara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous gravelly whisper. I do terrible things to terrible people so my grandmother can die in a warm bed instead of bleeding out in a warehouse. You think you understand my world because you pour drinks for losers and dodge muggers on your walk home. You know nothing. She turned on her heel. Lock the door if it makes you feel better. The guards outside will ensure you aren't disturbed. The door clicked shut behind her. The lock engaged from the outside. Sloane stood alone in the center of the massive, beautiful room, the ice pack burning against her skin. She walked over to the window and looked out at the black water. She wasn't just a guest. She was a piece on a chessboard, completely at the mercy of a woman who didn't know how to lose. And yet, despite everything, her Omega instincts whispered a truth she wasn't ready to face. You're not afraid of her. You're afraid of how safe she makes you feel. 4 days in a fortress changes a person. The initial terror calcified into a dull grinding frustration. The Rossi estate ran like a high-end military installation, meals delivered precisely at 8, 1, and 7, maids materializing like ghosts to clean rooms and vanishing just as quickly. The perimeter patrolled by silent women in dark suits carrying concealed weapons. Sloane refused to assimilate. She left the designer clothes hanging in the cedar-lined wardrobe, choosing instead to wash her cheap jeans and work shirt in the massive porcelain sink of her own suite bathroom, hanging them over the heated towel racks to dry. She refused the trays of prime rib and seared scallops, walking down to the industrial kitchen at odd hours to make herself plain toast and black coffee. She was looking for friction. She needed to know the edges of her cage. Thursday morning, precisely 6 a.m. The kitchen was empty, entirely devoid of the bustling staff that usually arrived at 7. Sloane stood in her faded jeans, barefoot on the cold tile, waiting for the water in the kettle to boil. A shuffling sound broke the silence. Sloane turned. Standing in the archway was Eleanor. She looked significantly smaller than Sloane remembered from the grocery store, drowning in a heavy silk bathrobe. Her white hair was mussed, and her eyes held that terrible glassy emptiness of a mind untethered from the present. "Maria," Eleanor called out, her voice frail and trembling. "Maria, the stove is cold. My daughter needs her coffee." Sloane didn't panic. She'd learned how to handle people who weren't in their right minds. The strategy was always the same: agree, redirect, anchor. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," Sloane said, keeping her voice incredibly soft and even. She stepped away from the kettle, keeping her hands visible. Maria stepped out for a moment. "I'm taking over the coffee." Eleanor blinked, staring at her. The confusion deepened, her brow furrowing. "You aren't Maria. Where is my coat? I need to go down to the docks." "The shipment." She started to turn, her breathing growing shallow and panicked. "The girls at the dock, they won't unload without me." "The docks are closed today due to the rain, Eleanor." Sloane lied smoothly, walking slowly toward her. She pulled out a heavy oak bar stool. The foreman called. Everyone went home. "Why don't you sit down and I'll bring you that coffee?" Eleanor hesitated, looking toward the dark windows. The rain was lashing against the glass. The physical evidence seemed to anchor her slightly. Her shoulders dropped. "Closed," she muttered. "Good. My back hurts." She shuffled to the stool and sat down heavily. Sloane quickly fixed a mug of black coffee, adding 2 sugars just to give her something to taste, and slid it across the marble island. Eleanor wrapped her spotted hands around the warm ceramic. "Thank you, sweetheart," she murmured. "You're welcome." "She doesn't know how to do it, you know," Eleanor said suddenly, staring into the black liquid. Her voice shifted, sounding suddenly clearer, heavier. "Who doesn't?" "Ilara." Eleanor looked up, and for a fleeting second the fog cleared, the sharp, intelligent eyes of the patriarch returned. "She knows how to build the walls. She knows how to shoot the wolves. But she doesn't know how to live inside the house. She thinks fear is the same thing as safety." Sloane went entirely still. The hairs on her arms stood up. Before she could answer, a shadow detached itself from the hallway. Elara stepped into the kitchen. She was fully dressed in a dark suit, her tie perfectly knotted. How long she had been standing there, watching Sloane handle her grandmother, Sloane had no idea. But her face was tight, her jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched near her ear. "Grandma," Elara said quietly, stepping forward. "It's early. The doctor wants you resting until 8. Eleanor looked at Elara. The brief window of lucidity slammed shut. The old woman smiled pleasantly. "Good morning, dear. This nice girl was just telling me the docks are closed." "They are." Elara agreed smoothly, her eyes flicking to Sloane. There was a complex weight in her gaze, something caught between gratitude and intense irritation. "Let's get you back upstairs. The floors down here are cold." She helped the old woman up, her large hands incredibly gentle on Eleanor's fragile shoulders. As they reached the archway, Elara stopped and looked back at Sloane. "My office. Tonight at 10, she commanded softly. "We need to talk." The day dragged by. When the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10, Sloane pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of Elara's office. The room smelled of old leather, expensive scotch, and wood smoke. Elara was sitting behind a massive desk, pouring amber liquid into 2 crystal glasses. She didn't look up as Sloane entered, she just pushed one glass across the polished wood. "I don't drink while I'm working," Sloane said, staying near the door. "You aren't working. And neither am I." Elara picked up her glass, taking a slow sip. She looked exhausted, the brutal, untouchable armor entirely gone, leaving behind a woman who looked like she carried the weight of a crumbling empire. "You handled her well this morning," Elara said, staring at the amber liquid. "Better than the nurses. They panic when she forgets the year. They try to correct her. It just makes her agitated. You don't fight a current." Sloane walked closer to the desk, refusing to sit. "You swim parallel to it until you find a place to stand. My mother had rough days toward the end. The meds scrambled her. You learn how to navigate the delusion." Elara set her glass down. "I owe you an apology." The words sounded foreign in her mouth, as if she hadn't used them in a decade. "I brought you here and treated you like a liability to be managed. I assumed you were fragile. I'm not fragile. I'm poor. There's a massive difference." Elara let out a short, quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "Yes. There is." She leaned back, studying Sloane with those dark, unreadable eyes. "The women in the alley were contractors hired by a rival family looking to probe my defenses. They are dead now. The threat is neutralized." Sloane's stomach dropped. The casual admission of murder chilled the room. "So I can go?" "You can." Elara agreed slowly, her dark eyes locking onto Sloane's. "I will have a car take you back. I will buy you a new apartment. I will clear your debts. The ledger will be balanced." She was offering exactly what Sloane wanted, freedom. Independence. A clean break. But as Sloane looked at the woman behind the desk, she remembered the way Elara had gently guided her confused grandmother out of the kitchen. She remembered the desperate, lonely look in Eleanor's eyes. She remembered Elara's quiet admission, "I control what I must to keep my family alive." She didn't reach for the glass. She didn't turn toward the door. "And who makes Eleanor her coffee tomorrow?" Sloane asked. Elara's hand tightened around the edge of her desk. The silence between them stretched thick and dangerous, shifting the ground entirely beneath their feet. Elara did not answer immediately. She sat perfectly still behind the massive mahogany desk, the amber liquid in her glass catching the dim light of the desk lamp. Her dark eyes searched Sloane's face, looking for the trap. In her world, altruism was a myth. Every favor was a hook. Every concession was a calculated risk. "You're volunteering to stay," Alara said slowly. It wasn't a question, she was testing the structural integrity of the concept. "I am negotiating employment." Sloane crossed her arms. The heavy, expensive silence of the office pressed against her, but she refused to step back. "You need someone to anchor Eleanor when her mind drifts. Your security details look at her like a broken piece of furniture. Your nurses treat her like a toddler. She's an old woman losing her grip on reality, and she needs someone who knows how to hold her hand without stripping her dignity." Alara set her glass down. The soft click echoed loudly. "And you believe you are uniquely qualified for this?" "I took care of my mother for 4 years." Sloane's voice dropped the defensive edge, settling into cold hard fact. "I know how to manage sundowning. I know how to check medications. And more importantly, I am the only person in this fortress who isn't terrified of you." A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of Alara's mouth. It was a micro-expression, gone before it fully registered. "You should be terrified of me." "Maybe. But I'm not." Sloane uncrossed her arms and placed her palms flat on his desk. "I want a formal contract. Fair market rate for a live-in care coordinator. I want a W-2. I want my medical debts paid off as a signing bonus, not a charity handout. And I want the freedom to come and go from this estate without 2 armed gorillas following me to the pharmacy." Alara watched Sloane's hands on her desk, looked at her chipped nail polish, the faint white scars on her knuckles from years of manual labor. Then she looked up at her face. "The gorillas stay," Alara counted smoothly. "Non-negotiable. If you work for me, you are a target. They will ride in a separate vehicle. They will stay out of your line of sight. But they stay." Sloane considered this. It was a concession dressed as an order. "Fine. Your debts will be cleared by tomorrow afternoon." Alara's voice returned to that crisp executive cadence. "Your salary will be triple the market rate to compensate for the unorthodox nature of your employer. You answer only to me. You handle Eleanor. You manage her schedule. You tell the medical staff what to do. If they refuse, you tell me, and they will be replaced. Deal." Alara stood. The sheer size of her dominated the room, casting a long shadow across the Persian rug. She extended her right hand. Sloane looked at it, the faint jagged scar crossing her knuckles fully visible now. She reached out and gripped Alara's hand. Her skin was warm, calloused, and her grip was firm without being crushing. It felt like shaking hands with a loaded gun. "Welcome to the family business, Sloane," Alara said quietly. Over the next 3 weeks, the dynamic within the stone fortress shifted. Sloane didn't just manage Eleanor, she inadvertently humanized the estate. She fired the lead nurse on day 4 for speaking to Eleanor in a patronizing baby voice. When the woman threatened to go to Alara, Sloane simply pointed to the door. Alara watched the entire exchange from the second-floor landing. She didn't intervene. The nurse packed her bags. Eleanor flourished. Sloane established a rigid routine, anchoring her days with familiar, tangible tasks. She bought her cheap 100-piece puzzles that they completed at the kitchen island. She played old radio broadcasts from the 1950s. She learned the exact ratio of cream to sugar Eleanor preferred. Alara became a ghost haunting her own home, leaving early, returning late into the night. Sloane caught glimpses of her, a dark figure standing by the window in the study, the smell of expensive cedar cologne lingering in the hallways, the quiet murmur of tense phone calls echoing from behind closed doors. They rarely spoke. But the silence between them was no longer hostile. It was observant. Charged with something neither of them was willing to name. One evening, Sloane was sitting on the floor of the library, stitching a torn seam in Eleanor's favorite cashmere coat. The fire was burning low. The heavy double doors opened and Alara stepped inside. She looked exhausted. Her tie was loose, her collar unbuttoned, and a faint smear of dried blood stained the cuff of her white shirt. She didn't acknowledge the blood. Sloane didn't ask. Alara walked to the heavy leather armchair opposite Sloane and collapsed into it. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the high back. She ate a full dinner tonight, Sloane said quietly, biting off the end of her thread. Roast chicken. She remembered your mother's birthday. Good. Alara's voice was thick with fatigue. Thank you. Sloane looked at the blood on her cuff. Looked at the dark circles bruised under her eyes. She was a monster to the city outside these walls. She shattered bones and ruined lives. But sitting here in the dim firelight, she just looked like a woman slowly drowning under the weight of an invisible ocean. Sloane folded the coat, placed it on the side table, and stood. She walked to the small bar cart in the corner, poured 2 fingers of Alara's expensive scotch into a crystal glass, and carried it over. She set it on the table beside her. You're paying me too much, Sloane said flatly. I figured I should start bartending again to earn my keep. She walked out of the library, leaving Alara alone with the fire and the scotch. It was a small, almost insignificant gesture. But in the underworld, small things were exactly what eventually brought down the empires. Violence rarely announces itself with a polite knock. It rips the door off the hinges. December arrived with a brutal biting cold that froze the bay into jagged plates of gray ice. Sloane was asleep, buried under the heavy down comforter of her guest room, when the alarms triggered. It wasn't a loud shrieking siren, it was a low vibrating hum that seemed to shake the very foundation of the stone estate, accompanied by the strobing pulse of red emergency lights in the hallway. Sloane threw off the covers, her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. She didn't freeze. The panic response she'd honed on the streets kicked in, sharp and clinical. She grabbed the heavy brass lamp from her nightstand, wrapping the cord tightly around her wrist. She opened her bedroom door. The hallway was chaos in motion. Women in dark tactical gear were moving with silent, terrifying speed. The estate's security detail was fully mobilized, assault rifles usually hidden now raised and ready. The smell of cold air and raw adrenaline flooded the corridor. Get back in your room, a guard barked, moving past her door. Where is Eleanor? Safe room. North wing. Lock your door. Sloane ignored her. She dropped the lamp, sprinted down the hall, and took the back stairs toward the foyer. The front doors were blown wide open, the freezing wind howling into the pristine marble entryway. 3 SUVs were parked haphazardly on the front driveway, their doors flung open. 2 guards were dragging a woman up the stone steps. It was Alara. Her charcoal suit was ruined, the fabric torn and soaked with a massive spreading stain of dark, heavy crimson. Her head slumped forward, her breathing coming in wet, ragged gasps. Medical room. Move, one of the guards screamed, completely dropping the usual professional stoicism. Sloane's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't think. She just moved. She intercepted them at the base of the stairs, sliding her shoulder under Alara's free arm, taking her weight. She was incredibly heavy, a dead weight of dense muscle. Alara's head rolled to the side, her dark eyes flickering, struggling to focus. She saw Sloane's face. Sloane. She grunted, blood staining her teeth. Get out of the hall. Shut up and walk. Sloane snapped, straining under the weight as they half carried, half dragged her down the corridor toward the sterile white room. They kicked the door open. The estate doctor was already there, snapping on blue latex gloves, her face pale and tight. On the table now. They hauled Elara onto the leather examination chair. She groaned, the deep, animalistic sound of pure agony, as her back hit the surface. The doctor grabbed a pair of tweezers and began cutting away the expensive wool of the suit jacket and the ruined shirt beneath. Sloane stood frozen at the foot of the chair. Elara's left side was a mangled ruin, 2 gunshot wounds, one high in the shoulder passing clean through, the other low in the abdomen. That was the bad one. Dark arterial blood pulsed sluggishly from the ragged hole, pooling quickly on the black leather. I need pressure on the stomach, the doctor yelled, turning to grab a tray of surgical instruments. Now. The guards hesitated. They were shooters, not medics. Sloane stepped forward. She grabbed a thick stack of sterile gauze from the counter, pressed it directly over the abdominal wound, and leaned her entire body weight onto her hands. Elara arched her back, a horrific strangled cry escaping her throat. Her hands, slick with her own blood, blindly reached out and gripped Sloane's forearms. Her fingers dug into Sloane's skin like iron clamps. Look at me. Sloane's voice was loud, slicing through the panic in the room. Elara. Look at me. Her eyes snapped to Sloane's, dilated, wild with pain and shock. Keep looking at me. Sloane pushed down harder on the wound. Warm blood soaked through the gauze, slipping between her fingers. The copper smell was overpowering. You're not dying tonight. Who makes Eleanor her coffee if you die? A dark, wet chuckle bubbled up from Elara's chest, turning quickly into a cough. You do. I quit. The hours are terrible. Sloane fired back. Stay with me. The doctor returned, moving with frantic precision. I have to dig the bullet out before I can clamp the bleeder. It's too deep. No time for local anesthetic to take full effect. Hold her down. The 2 guards moved in, pinning Elara's shoulders and legs. Elara's grip on Sloane's forearms tightened until she felt bruises forming. She didn't look at the ceiling. She didn't look at the doctor. She locked her eyes entirely on Sloane. Do it. The doctor went in with the forceps. Elara didn't scream again, she bit down on her lower lip until it bled, her entire body going rigid as a steel beam. Sloane held the pressure, her hands coated in Elara's blood, refusing to break eye contact. She anchored her, just as she anchored Eleanor. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the sickening wet slick of metal and tissue, the harsh ragged breathing of the women in the room, and the howling wind outside. Got it. The doctor finally breathed, dropping a deformed lump of lead into a metal kidney dish with a sharp clink. Clamping the artery. Bleeding is slowing. She's going to make it. Elara's head fell back against the leather, her eyes fluttering shut. Her grip on Sloane's arms slowly loosened, her hands falling limply to her sides. She was out. Sloane stepped back. The doctor took over packing and stitching the wound. She walked over to the stainless steel sink in the corner and turned the faucet on. The water ran cold. She stared down at her hands, they were entirely coated in Elara's blood. The water turned a pale watery pink as it circled the drain. She had thought her job was to protect an old woman from a ruthless world. As she scrubbed the blood from under her fingernails, the cynical, cold reality settled into her bones. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was neck-deep in the violence. The ledger wasn't balanced. It was bleeding. And she was the one holding the gauze. 3 days passed in a haze of antiseptic and hushed voices. Ilara did not die. Women like her rarely surrendered to something as pedestrian as a bullet. She woke up 30 hours after the surgery, pale, furious, and barking orders at her lieutenants from the medical bed. Sloane stayed out of the way. She kept Eleanor occupied in the sunroom, playing endless games of gin rummy and lying through her teeth about Ilara's absence. She told the old woman her granddaughter was in Chicago finalizing a shipping contract. Eleanor accepted the lie with a gentle nod, her mind comfortably wrapped in the wool of the fiction. On the 4th night, the estate finally fell quiet. The lieutenants went home. The extra security shifted to the perimeter. Sloane walked into the medical room, holding a glass of ice water. The machines hummed a low steady rhythm. Ilara was awake, sitting up slightly, propped against rigid white pillows. The heavy bandages thick beneath her unbuttoned shirt. She looked like a ruin, but the flat, dangerous intensity in her eyes remained entirely intact. She tracked Sloane's movement as she crossed the room and set the glass on the metal tray beside her. "You lied to Eleanor," Ilara said. Her voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual smooth bass. "I protected her." Sloane pulled up a plastic chair and sat down, not flinching under Ilara's stare. "There's a difference. And you owe me for the dry cleaning. Your blood ruined my favorite shirt." Ilara looked away, staring at the blank white wall opposite her bed. For a long time the only sound was the mechanical click of the foredrip. The silence wasn't hostile. It was heavy with the things they hadn't said since Sloane stood over her, holding her artery shut. "The women who hit the house," Ilara started, her voice dropping into a dangerous register, were a splinter faction of the Costa Syndicate. "They thought I was distracted. They thought bringing a civilian into the house made me soft." "Did it?" Ilara turned her head slowly. She looked at Sloane, really looked at her. Took in the cheap jeans, the tired posture, the sheer stubborn grit that kept her rooted in a chair beside a woman who brought death to her own doorstep. "No," Ilara said quietly. "It made me careless. I assumed my walls were high enough to keep the wolves out. I forgot that wolves don't climb walls. They wait for the gate to open." She reached out, her movements stiff, muscles screaming against the stitches. She picked up a manila folder resting on the edge of her mattress and tossed it onto Sloane's lap. "What is this?" "Passports. A new identity. A bank account routed through a shell corporation in Zurich with enough money to disappear permanently." Ilara leaned back, closing her eyes. "The Costa faction is gone. I spent the last 3 days ensuring every woman involved in the raid was buried in the foundation of the new Southside development. But there will be others. There always are. You saw the reality of my life 4 nights ago, Sloane. It isn't a game. It is a slaughterhouse." Sloane opened the folder. The documents were flawless. The bank statement showed a figure with too many zeros for her brain to comfortably process. It was the ultimate payout. She could leave this stone fortress. Leave the blood. Leave the crushing gravity of Ilara Rossi. She closed the folder. "Does Eleanor know how to play gin rummy?" Sloane asked. Ilara opened her eyes, a deep frown creasing her forehead. "What?" "Because she cheated twice this afternoon." Sloane leaned back in her chair. She palmed a card. "Her dementia is real, but she uses it as a shield when she wants to win. She's sharp, Ilara. And she knows you're hurt. She asked me why the hallway smelled like iodine. I had to tell her a guard cut her hand on broken glass." Ilara stared at her, utterly derailed by the pivot. Sloane, I am giving you the exit. I know what you're giving me. Sloane tapped the folder. It's a clean conscience for you. If I take this, you don't have to worry about my blood on your hands. You get to go back to being the untouchable queen on the hill. But you're bleeding, Elara. Your grandmother is slipping away. And your empire is cracking at the edges. She stood up. She dropped the manila folder onto the metal tray right next to the ice water. I told you I negotiate my own terms. I don't run from a fight. And I don't abandon my debts. You brought me into this house to anchor your family. Now you're stuck with me. Elara looked at the discarded folder, then up at Sloane. The cynical, brutal armor she wore for the world finally cracked, completely and irreparably. A slow, genuine smile touched her lips, a rare, terrifying thing that changed the entire landscape of her face. You are a very stubborn Omega, Elara murmured. And you have terrible security. Sloane shot back. Drink your water, boss. You look like hell. She turned and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The ledger was finally closed. They didn't owe each other money or favors or duty. They owed each other survival. And in the dark, sprawling underworld of the city, that was a bond thicker than blood. 3 months later, the Rossi estate no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like home. Sloane had her own office now, a converted study on the second floor that looked out over the bay. She managed Eleanor's care with quiet efficiency and ran the household staff with the same no-nonsense practicality she'd once used to pour drinks at the Rusty Anchor. The guards had stopped treating her like a captive. They treated her like family. And Elara. Elara was different. The ice had thawed. She still ran her empire with iron fists, still disappeared for days at a time to handle business that left her smelling of gunpowder and cold rage. But she always came home. And when she did, she came to Sloane. Tonight, Sloane was in the library, curled in the leather armchair by the fire. Eleanor had gone to bed hours ago, her mind peaceful for once, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that Sloane had made her. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the bookshelves. The double doors opened. Elara stepped in, still in her suit from the office, her tie loosened. She looked tired but not defeated, the exhaustion of a long day rather than the weight of the world. Without a word, she walked to the armchair and settled on the floor beside it, her back against Sloane's chair. The intimacy of the gesture, the casual vulnerability, would have been unthinkable 3 months ago. Sloane looked down at her. The line of her jaw, the sharp curve of her cheek, the way the firelight caught the silver in her dark hair. Her hand rested on the arm of the chair, and Sloane's fingers brushed against it, a question, a tentative offer. Elara turned her hand over and interlocked their fingers. The touch sent a shiver down Sloane's spine, that familiar Omega heat, the pull of the bond that had been forming between them since the alley. You know, Sloane said softly, when I paid for your grandmother's milk, I didn't expect this. I thought it was $3. Spare change. Usually just buys you a bad coffee. Elara's grip tightened. $3.42, she corrected. I checked the receipt. Of course you did. Elara turned, looking up at Sloane with those dark, complicated eyes, eyes that had seen too much violence, too much death, too much of the worst the world had to offer. But when they looked at Sloane, they softened. Just a little. It bought me the undivided attention of the city's most dangerous woman, Sloane continued, a wry smile tugging at her lips. I think I got a good deal. Elara's smile was slow, rare, and utterly devastating. I think you did. She rose, turning to face Sloane properly. The firelight caught her features, soft and sharp all at once. She reached out, her hand cupping Sloane's cheek. The touch was impossibly gentle for fingers that had shattered bones. "Sloane," Alara said quietly, her voice rough with something that sounded almost like awe, "you changed everything. You walked into my world and refused to be afraid. You anchored my grandmother. You anchored me. I don't know how to be soft. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. But for you." She paused, her thumb tracing the line of Sloane's cheekbone. "For you, I want to try." Sloane's heart hammered. The pull between them was magnetic, inevitable, the culmination of months of tension and unspoken words. She leaned into Alara's touch, her Omega instinct singing with the rightness of it. "I don't need you to be soft," Sloane said. "I just need you to be here. With me. That's all I've ever needed." Alara's smile widened, just a fraction, just enough. "You're impossible. And you're a Mafia boss with terrible security." Sloane leaned forward, her lips brushing against Alara's ear. "But I'm not going anywhere." The night deepened around them, the fire casting its warm glow on two women who had found each other in the most unlikely of places. The world outside was violent and cold, full of people who would tear them apart if given half a chance. But in this room, there was only the crackling fire and the steady rhythm of their breathing. Sloane's fingers tangled in Alara's hair. Alara's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close. The bond between them, Alpha and Omega, protector and partner, was a living thing, pulsing with a warmth that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice. "Tell me again," Alara murmured against her lips. "Tell me you're staying." "I'm staying." Sloane's voice was fierce, certain. "I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you." Alara kissed her, deep and slow, a promise sealed with fire and shadow. Outside the windows, the rain lashed against the glass, and the city churned with its endless chaos. But in this place, in this moment, there was only peace. And the beginning of something that would outlast empires.